Hello. So I'm gonna just move on with this whole thing. Oh, by the way, this 666 is out. I don't know if you can see it. Redid this desk. Kind of nice, right? I tell you the truth, and I do not lie. I have been accused of telling many lies. And, well, when people disagree with you, they get very upset, they get all hot headed, and they call you a liar. And I didn't appreciate that. But I can understand why. You know, losers. No, I don't mean to insult you. I'm just going to systematically destroy Arminianism. I love this. Many people will argue that God is unjust and say that Calvinism can never be right. First of all, I never read Calvin. I read the Bible. I came to this by reading the scriptures, and the scriptures are very, very, very plain and clear. So let us move to that infamous chapter that everybody hates if they're Arminian, Romans chapter 9. The funny thing about Romans chapter 9, I'd like to explain to you, is that every single Arminian argument is completely destroyed by Romans chapter 9. Every single one. And the problem is that they can't accept losing. It's incredible. They'll go, well, that's not fair. That God chooses who he chooses. But it says very plainly in Romans chapter 9, I will choose who I choose. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. And very clear. Then we'll say, well, then how can God judge anybody? But Romans 9 answers it and says, but who are you, O God, O man, to answer back to God? Doesn't God have right over the pot, like the potter have the right over the clay to do what he wishes with the clay? Remember, God formed Adam out of clay. Well, then, how does he have any right to judge anything? Answered again in Romans chapter 9. And those are the three huge arguments. Every single argument that you can find an Arminian has is all answered in Romans chapter 9. So here's the thing. They use Romans chapter 8 and say, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. And whom he predestined, he also called. And whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. So, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Now notice that he called people according to his purpose. If you say that, well, no, we chose him and then he chose us, then it would be according to our purpose. It wouldn't be according to God's purpose, because if God had a purpose and a plan, and he had planned from the beginning who was going to be saved and who was not going to be saved, then it can't be that your will actually did this, because then it would be your plan. So what does this word foreknow mean, or foreknew mean? Well, funny thing is that foreknew, what they read into this is they read into that God looked into the future. You have to understand it. God looked into the future and he foreknew who was going to choose him first according to their purpose. See, the whole thing is convoluted. It really doesn't make any sense, but it has to make sense to them because they can't accept it any other way. The word foreknew and the word to know somebody has to do with a term of endearment. And the thing is well, people will say, well, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. Well, the thing is that the word foreknew or to know somebody was a personal thing. It actually had to do with like marriage. Like Adam knew his wife, So those he foreknew, he also predestined. And the funny thing is the word predestined doesn't fit with the word post-destined. In other words, those he foreknew in the future, he predestined. Do you understand how that doesn't work? Those he knew, who he would have said, those he foreknew were going to choose him, he then destined. But when he says predestined, you see how the words don't make sense. You want them to, but they don't. But the problem is Romans chapter 9 doesn't even allow it. Because he said, that is, It is not to the children of the flesh who are children of God, but to the children of the promise who are regarded as the descendants. This is speaking of Abraham's children not being all being descendants, because not all Israel is Israel. This is Romans chapter 9. It's all in there. For this is the word of promise. At this time I will come and Sarah shall have a son. And basically it was told that he would have, that son would not be Ishmael, but the chosen one would be Isaac. And not only this, but there was Rebekah, who was Isaac's son, Jacob's, Isaac and Rebekah, right? There was Rebekah, that was Isaac's wife. And when she had conceived the twins by one man, and our father Isaac, for though the twins were not yet born. In other words, nobody chose anybody. The twins weren't born yet and had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose according to his choice might stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. And funny, in the last video, I talked about you can't come to the Father unless the Father grant it to you. It's very plain, but you see, they'll say, well, this has to do with nations. No, it doesn't. It has to do with those who are chosen by the promise. And not all those who are descendants of Isaac are of the promise, but those who are chosen by faith. But it is not as though the word of God has failed. This is the Israelites had rejected. Paul was all upset about it. This is all in Romans chapter 9. For they are not all Israel who are descended from Jacob or Israel. Neither are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants. But through Isaac your descendants will be named. Isaac was the child of promise. Ishmael, the brother, wasn't. But it wasn't by bloodlines. You say through Isaac, but it wasn't all Israel. Not all Israel is Israel. So who is Israel? Okay. So it says, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. What then shall we say? Is there no injustice with God? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be. Now, this is the first question that's answered. People will say, well, that's not fair that God chooses who he chooses. And he says, people will ask the questions. Paul lays it out and says, people will say that God is unjust to choose who he chooses. And isn't that answering Arminianism? God doesn't have the right to do what he wants to do? That's the hard thing to accept, but that's the truth. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. So now it's talking about man. It does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. This is talking about men now. It's not talking about nations. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. Pharaoh was destroyed. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and whom he desires, or whom he hardens, he hardens whom he desires. You say, well, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Well, God was working with his heart, and it was hardened. He hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would fall. He did this purposely. Did Pharaoh have a choice in it? This is the whole problem. You shall say to me then, why does he still find fault for who resists his will? Ooh, wait a minute. Was your question answered again? This is the second Arminian question. First it says, I will have mercy. First he says, I rose up to Pharaoh so that I could destroy him. Then it says, so then he has mercy on whom he desires, and whom he desires he hardens. He says that I purposely rose up Pharaoh for the reason of showing my glory. Then he says, you will say to me then, why does God still find fault? In other words, how can God judge us if he was the one that made us, right? And this seems unjust to you, right? But your question was answered. For who has resisted God's will? In other words, if it's not your will or your choice, then why does God have the right to judge anybody? That is the second. All of your answers, your Arminian answers are right here. And what does Paul say to this? On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me this like this? Will it? this is the answer that they will not. This is a slap in the face that Paul gave through God to those Arminians who say, well, God doesn't have the right to do that. Yes, he does, and you don't have a right to say anything about it. This is the thing that you don't like. This is the offense of the gospel. But it's clearly and plainly answered. Or does not the potter have the right over the clay to make some from the same lump of clay, one vessel for honorable use and the other for common use? God did this whole thing because he has the right to do it. And he is just and right because he is the one that made us. What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath like Pharaoh, prepared for destruction, prepared in advance, chosen for destruction? And he did so in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon, and he did so that he could make known the riches of his glory upon the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. In other words, we didn't choose him. God did not look into the future. And this is what you're trying to say in Romans chapter 8. God looked into the future. It's very clear when it says, not for though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose according to his choice might stand and not your choice. You notice it says his choice might stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. Does this say that you weren't called? Does this say that you chose him, that he saw that you were going to call him? Or does this say that before you were born, you were predestined, that God gave you a destiny? And when this says, and he did this in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon the vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, I thank God for that. Thank God that he let me know that I'm chosen by him. I feel very special. It's what makes my relationship with Christ. Even us, and this is what ties it in. When he says even us, see, you could say this is all about nations here, but the problem is that right here it says, even us whom he also called, not from among the Jews only. Even us whom he also called, not from among the Jews only, but also from among the Gentiles. It's very clear that he chose people from among the Jews, because not all Israel is Israel, but those according to the promise. And he said, even us, that includes me and anybody who comes to Christ by his power, whom he has called, not from among the Jews only, but also from among the Gentiles. As it says in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. Look, the problem here is that all of your questions were answered, and you'll say, "Oh no, this had to do." You're taking it out of context. It can't mean that. It can't mean that. It does mean that, and the problem is that people cannot accept it. And I understand the anger. The problem is that that's what Satan does. Satan hates the chosen, just like Ishmael hated Isaac and they're still fighting today. Because I'm chosen, and those who aren't chosen, who hate God because of the idea of being chosen, are all condemned. Oh, you can't say that. It's very plain in Romans chapter 6, verse 666. For 665 said, you can't come to the Father unless God chose you or God grants it to you. And to this many disciples left. This is what the Arminian does. This is why, to me, it's very obvious that, and it's very possible that the Arminians never knew Christ because they can't accept him. They can't let God be God. I'm just saying, it doesn't look to me like Arminians really know God, because then they would be able to accept the words that Jesus said. Thank you.